kind of see that sort of pop culture thread appear in the film version of Barney's version, which, as you said, it's an endearing work, and it's
Right.
maybe not as grating or
Right.
doesn't rankle people in the same way.
Right. So it's interesting because the novel itself was, in its way, less aggressive than some of his previous works and less challenging, maybe. So something like Solomon Gursky was here a way more challenging novel, not as, in no way as beloved by a popular audience. And then you're right, they take the film and they make it even a bit more lovable. And I guess that has to do with the the need for an American audience. So in that case, they really made a very clear decision. I think it was probably a mistake, but maybe popularly not, to cut out the Quebec stuff. So Barney's version is a novel that is not totally embroiled in that, but he's a voice with a lot to say in a kind of an aggressive and funny way, the way the characters are in some earlier books. And they cut it all out, and the only thing is, if you know the city, you'll recognize buildings. So Montrealers surely know where Sherbrooke Street fits in each scene, and then they go up on the actual hill point where he's buried. So this kind of interplay between his own life and what they're doing in their film. I found that a bit off-putting because I couldn't quite understand how much they wanted the film to be about the author.
Yeah, it's true, because they even changed. His wife ends up going to New York instead of Toronto, or she's from so there's all sorts of things.
They take these opportunities. It's no surprise in some way, but to Americanize the story. And you read the variety of reviews. Some people really think it's a mistake. Some don't seem to notice. Seems to sort of vary in reception.
Do you think that maybe a project like this academic project, maybe refocuses or shifts over the conversation surrounding Richler from the celebration of this icon to maybe sort of examining the sort of crevices?
The easy answer is yes. I think so. And the voices are from all over the world. There's one of the authors is from Łódź, Poland. One is from London, England. So this is the sort of thing that Richler certainly wanted throughout his career. He wanted an international readership. I would say that his international readership is a good deal smaller than we in Canada might think, and that this kind of work, a film goes international too. This kind of work, I guess, in some ways tries to acknowledge that there are readers in other countries, and in what way they see us, and in what way they read a Canadian icon like Richler. And then we stuck to something maybe that the film cut out. I mean, we really went that old route. We got the guy who does the tours, with bad knees, and he's not doing them anymore because his knees are too bad. But he knows everything about the neighborhood. So we sort of went in the forward direction with these young scholars, but then went back to the neighborhood, took these wonderful photographs, captured the thing that in many ways readers kind of love, what it is about this time and place that they keep wanting to recover.
Now, in your introduction to the issue, and as you mentioned earlier, there are several different kinds of reconsiderations of Richler's work that are being enacted right now, and one of them is maybe these younger Francophone scholars reevaluating his work, and you being in Montreal, I'm wondering if you noticed if his reputation is changing.
Yeah, amongst very young people in Montreal, and then maybe a tiny bit in the university community in Quebec. I think the thing that they recognized was they had this really interesting writer whom they'd never taken a look at, and he's a Montreal writer. And they're a generation that doesn't have the baggage that prior generations had, so they don't have to view him politically, only define him in terms of the way he responded to the language debates in the province. They view him as a writer. They're interested in his way of bringing Yiddish-inflected speech into English. The thing that I did hear early was that the French language translations of Richler are terrible. They were done in France. and the people that did them had no cultural recognition of Maurice Richard or you name it. This stuff is all off key, so that there's an ongoing need to retranslate these books. So we're probably still at a very early point, and the two young women who ended up not being in here, in part because it had been so long since we interviewed them, they sort of forgot what we had even done with them. So they said, nah. But one is a French language novelist in Quebec, and one is focuses to some extent on translating. They worked together to translate a collection of Richler's personal essays, and that was published in French. And that got a pretty good hearing, and it was one of the first cases where his work really was being moved into the French language readership in a whole new way. So that was, remarkable and early, and there probably hasn't been that much more of it since, but you can see that there's the motivation there among young people.
And another, I think she's a younger scholar, Lena Baumsinger, that you touched on earlier, had a different take on Richler altogether. And I found it interesting that she saw Richler as a way of thinking about whiteness and racialization in Canada, because, as you say, he rankled people with the way that he presented Jewish difference. And maybe it brings attention to a tendency in Canada to maybe believe that we're all happy and harmonious together.
Yeah, and the success of some of our immigrant groups is another thing that kind of glosses over, ongoing challenges for groups. The Jewish story is pretty, unique in its way, because Jews were sure not white up to the Second World War, and they weren't even white after the Second World War, but boy, they got white fast in the late 40s, and that was Richler's, he was already a young man at that point, but so it's so interesting, how a writer's timing is crucial to what it is he has to say. So he grows up during the Second World War when things are really very dark, and in Quebec, in his mind, threatening for Jews, because of his sense of the Catholic anti-Semitism, which he remembered with great hurt. But then after the war, everything started to change very fast. You have this influx of Holocaust survivors, but then you also get this whitening of Jews, their movement to the suburbs, their increasing access to universities and professional jobs and positions that they would never have had in decades before. And I think he resented it on some level. It seemed that, so he goes away to London and he looks at it from there. But it looked hokey to him, I think, because he remembered the particular experiences of his childhood and then this sudden change. And he's a satirist, but he loved to mock the all-rightnik, the person who grabs hold of that new prosperity and sort of rides it for all he can. One could argue that it's sort of strange. He's off in London trying to be successful in his own milieu. He's doing it in his own way. But he felt the moment that when he was young, and then he really kind of followed to the shifts after that. And then he stuck with a kind of a satire that I would think most non-Jewish readers just don't get, and it just goes right past them, which is this kind of Jew that moves, out of the working class neighborhoods up into the more successful neighborhoods like Westmount. And to him, in his mind, they become these kind of waxworks. They're these faux Westmounters. They're never anything in his mind but funny. So he loved the kind of ironies that came out of those changes in immigrant life.
And do you think maybe it was a suspicion of this kind of assimilation into dominant white Canadian society?
It seemed complicated. I think he loved what he came from. This scrappy, hard-bitten immigrant neighborhood where you might have been a little bit fearful, but boy, people knew each other and loved each other. It was a sort of nostalgia even for the thing he had himself left behind. So it seemed mixed up, I think, in his view, exactly what it meant to leave this place, what of it you could keep with you as you went further afield, even to another country. What of it was so much truer in his mind than the thing. That would be, I guess, the way to answer your question. Yeah. That it was somehow, it's not a real idea, but we all feel this in some way, that our youth was the true place. This is where we really were who we should be. And then off we go to be these kind of, play these adult roles or enter a broader society and become somehow, watered down versions of the thing that we were. So it seemed to be all mixed up with nostalgia, with his love of his youth, with his love of those streets. Kind of a really complicated mix, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And even though, as you say, he was moved from Montreal and he's writing about a Montreal that maybe doesn't exist anymore, right. Do you still find that it's useful to read about those kinds of tensions and think about how maybe they still operate today, maybe on a more subtle level? Well,
Montreal's neat, and this is sort of a whole other discussion, but if you go to these streets, so the ones that he writes about in a book like Duty Kravitz, with Saint-Laurent up the middle and the ones that fall to the side of it, there's this nice kind of rectangle, that a lot of which is still not that unlike physically what it was like when he was young and in the period in which he was first writing about it. So it's a kind of unusual thing in Canada. In cities like Vancouver, that's almost impossible to, read about things in the 40s and then actually go to that street and kind of walk around and think, oh yeah, I can kind of feel it. So in that way, he operates very well as a kind of ethnographer, as a kind of a cultural historian. And the quirk of Montreal, because of the bad years when the economy collapsed and there was no outside investment because they were threatening to separate, is that the city is kind of intact, his city. You don't walk there and feel heartbroken because there's nothing in view. There's still quite a bit in view. So his books then are kind of a portal back. And then you could think, as your questions are sort of pushing, you could think about the way you could think clearly about the way communities live and change, and in what way in Canadian cities they get kind of, whatever you want to say, gathered in one place, and then in what way they abandon that place. So there's a lot of ongoing Canadian stuff that's mapped very clearly in some of his books.
And it doesn't just have to be specifically Montreal-centered, like we can look at it writ large.
So when I teach a book like Duty Kravitz, which is the one I tend to teach, I'm always trying to push the students, to think about what this narrative and the town that they can go visit might tell us about Vancouver, might tell us about Calgary. And I think it works, although if you don't actually know those cities, it's very hard to believe it. But I think he's the strongest case study. So you got to have him. I don't think you could do the course on Canadian Jewish literature without him. You got to have him. But then he can surely help you go to Calgary, help you go to Vancouver, and do the specific version of that city's, say, immigrant story there. Yeah.
So he does have a much wider relevance than maybe initially he might be categorized within.
I would say so, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thanks. Lots of fun.